Corcoran confidence intervals. Exactly the same finding in our data. And that's what's making the blue line different from the red line here. And what I'm trying to stress is even though you have that much uncertainty, there's still some information here. And so you don't want to just throw it away. You want to incorporate it into your feedback and evaluation system. So for instance, one of my co-authors, Jonah Rokoff, who works quite a bit on education, he has a paper showing that if you provide principals this sort of information, and they use that when evaluating teachers and providing feedback to teachers, that can actually be quite useful in improving outcomes.
My question deals more with subject matter. Was there a correlation in your studies between subject matter competency and expected outcome in adulthood? You know, the kids that scored better in certain areas and lower than others, how did they perform?
Yeah, great question. Another graph that I didn't bring with me. So first of all, we're only able to study math and English because those are the subjects for which there are standardized tests. So between those two subjects, we ask which subjects matter more, and the answer is kind of interesting. So if I just look at the correlation between test scores and earnings, it turns out that there is a much stronger correlation between outcomes as adults and English test scores relative to math. But if I look at teachers' impacts, it turns out that the dispersion of teachers' impacts on math is much greater than in reading. So to state that differently, there's more variability or more ability for teachers to do better in terms of math teaching than English teaching. There are larger differences across teachers. And so then when you combine those two factors and you say, what's the value of having a 95th percentile, like top 5% teacher versus average teacher in math versus in reading, the answer to that question ends up being it's about the same for both subjects because you have these two opposite factors, right? The reading is more correlated with earnings, but then there's a bigger effect of teachers on the math scores.
Excluding specialized high schools or schools in general, the trend seems to be that many students are separated based on ability in the classroom. So in a case like that, in situations like that, does the star teachers, are they able to make a difference, or how would that shift?
So if I restate your question to make sure I understand it, you're asking if the benefit of having a star teacher is different if the kids are separated based on ability versus if they're pooled. So I don't directly have an answer to that question for you because we haven't studied that. What I can tell you is that the value of star teachers seems to be substantial and of the magnitude that I'm showing you here across many different types of classrooms. In low SES schools and higher SES schools, for boys, for girls, for different ability levels. So that makes me think that the answer to your question is that their effects are going to be pronounced in both settings. Where they might end up being bigger, which is like a question of how you organize classrooms, is not something that I can directly answer.
So I have a question about the effects of more than one star teacher.
Yeah.
Any studies with that?
Yeah, another great question. We've studied that to a limited extent. So what we're able to say is that if you have both a very good math teacher and a very good English teacher, the effects seem to be basically additive. So the rough way to think about it, at least in what I've seen in the data, is every extra good teacher helps you, essentially. Now, what I can't get at for statistical reasons is what the effect of having, say, like 10 excellent teachers in a row is. And that's actually a very complicated thing to figure out. It's possible that the effects would be like much greater than just the sum total, like they build on each other. It's also possible that the cumulative effect might be smaller, like you just need one great teacher to inspire you. That's another area where I think we'll see more work.
I'm really interested in the non-cognitive versus cognitive question. There's probably no answer for this, but I'm wondering if you've looked at, are there teachers who may be good teachers just on the non-cognitive measures, not so much on the cognitive, and how would you measure that? How do you know? And then if so, who has the bigger? You talked a little bit about that, but is there more you can say about that?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. I wish I could say more about that. Here's what I think we do know. So I showed you, as you exactly saw, that the teachers who were raising standardized test scores were also improving non-cognitive skills. But a very natural question to ask is, forget about standardized test scores. There must be some other teachers who are just directly improving non-cognitive skills, right? What are those teachers doing? What are their benefits? Turns out we don't have enough data really in what we have to answer that question directly. And the problem is fundamentally that we're very good at collecting standardized test information for millions of kids. We have 17 million observations on that. This stuff that I was showing you here, where we measure the non-cognitive skills, right, using these types of surveys, we're starting to develop a little bit better data infrastructure on that, but it's still far too small. So I'm hoping you'll really answer it in a few years.
Hi there. We spend a lot of time talking about professional development and teacher reflection and room for improvement. Now, did you find any evidence for the fact that teachers can grow and improve over time and improve their value-added scores and therefore improve their ability to affect students?
Yeah, absolutely. So we find very clear evidence that value-added increases with experience, but that effect is concentrated in the first 2 or 3 years. So there's a big difference between first-year teachers and second-year teachers. There's a bit of an increment going to the third year, but then it pretty much levels off. And so, I think there's clearly an experience component. I think that matters a lot when thinking about policies like Teach for America, like programs like that, where you don't end up sometimes having teachers stick around that long. But in the longer run, experience seems to be awesome.
Just a quick question on some of the data. When you showed the impact on income, and you had the range from $10,000 to $25,000, and you extrapolated that to say that that could have a significant change in terms of 2.5 times in terms of GDP. However, your population was a population that was fairly low income.
Yes.
So if you were to move that to a higher income, is it 2.5, or is it just simply adding $15,000?
Yeah. Great question. Again, another thing that's in this paper, but I didn't have time to talk about here. So we actually look at the impacts on different socioeconomic status groups. So that Tennessee study is focused on a relatively low SES population, but in this large city that we study, there's a dispersion of income naturally. So you can look at people who are coming from families that are relatively low income, but also middle income, and also towards the higher end of the distribution. And here's what we find. When you get to incomes of like 50,000, 70,000, and so forth, so well off that chart I'm showing you, the impacts turn out to be constant in percentage terms rather than in dollar terms. So here's why that's important. Because 10% of 75,000 is a much bigger number than 10% of 25,000, right? So actually that 2.5 times number that I was telling you is in dollar terms going to be even bigger, because for the higher SES groups, there's a bigger dollar impact of having a better teacher because there's a similar percentage impact. So you might not have expected that. A lot of people thought we're going to find big impacts of teachers for kids from lower income families, but maybe not so much higher income families. But no, it actually seems like in a dollar sense, it's even more.
Hi. From your study, and what implications can we draw from your study in terms of preparing good teachers so that we have some predicted outcomes in the future?
What implications can we draw in terms of finding more very good teachers? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
How we prepare, young
Yes.
teachers.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's, I guess, literally the million-dollar question, right? So I don't have a great answer for that because I think we don't actually exactly know. So my understanding, this is not my work now, my understanding from the pure education research is that many standard training efforts have not actually been shown to have tremendously large impacts, unfortunately. So I don't think we've found a clear way to raise a given teacher's quality. At least we haven't established it clearly yet. Now, a different approach that one can take is to try to attract more talent, more superstar teachers into the teaching profession. So often people cite the example of places like Finland, which have great educational outcomes. And this is by no means an experiment, this is just speculation, really. But if you think about a place like Finland, what's different is that teaching is a profession that attracts the top students who are graduating from college. It's not only financially well rewarded, but socially, in terms of sort of social status, peer recognition, teaching is like a thing that you really want to go into if you're at the top of your class, right? And unfortunately, like I see this with our own students at Harvard, that's often not the case for students in the US. And so my own view is that in the longer run, the way you have an impact is by perhaps changing the way that teachers are compensated, making it sort of an elite profession where it's tough to get in, it's tough to get those jobs, but if you make it, you're treated like kind of superstar, as you should be, because you're having these tremendous impacts on so many kids over your career.
Hi, I wonder if you could talk a little bit to the issue of the relationship between the high-quality teacher and the standardized test score, and how we're basically setting up this plan for new teachers to come in and make sure their test scores are high, and thus teach to the test. And if you've looked at this type of teaching practice of teaching to the test.
Yeah, so that's another question for which I don't have an answer for you right now, but actually one of my PhD students' dissertation is exactly on this question. So one of the concerns with using these value-added measures for evaluation is that you create an incentive, you create a lot of pressure for teachers to focus on test score impacts. And then that's potentially a bad